Seeing me holding my newborn in worn-out clothes, my grandfather frowned. Wasn't $250,000 a month enough? I never received a single dollar, I said. He immediately picked up his phone and called his lawyers. My grandfather had never cried in front of me, not at my grandmother's funeral, not during his first heart surgery at 71, not even at my wedding, though I had seen him blink hard during the vows, in that controlled way men of his generation treat grief as something private. But when he walked into my hospital room 3 days after I gave birth and truly looked at me, at the same shirt I had been wearing since Tuesday, at the dark circles under my eyes, at the way I tensed when the nurse mentioned the bill, his chin moved in a way I had never seen before. It trembled once, then he steadied it again. "Claire," he said quietly, pulling a chair closer and sitting down like his legs had suddenly remembered his age. "Wasn't $250,000 a month enough?" I thought I had misheard. "What?" "The money," he clarified, his tone calm and measured. "I've been sending it since your wedding day, every first of the month without fail. I wanted you to be comfortable, to never have to work." His eyes dropped to my hands, rough from the night cleaning job I had taken at 6 months pregnant because we couldn't pay the electricity bill. He assumed I was choosing to live simply. My daughter was asleep on my chest, 8 pounds, 4 ounces, 2 days old, and already the most real thing in my world. "Grandpa," I said, my voice unsteady, "I've never seen a single dollar." The color drained from his face. He stayed silent for a moment, then took out his phone, pressed one contact, and said, "Get me Patricia, now." That was when the door opened. "My name is Claire Ashworth. I'm 29 years old, and until 72 hours ago, I believed I had a clear understanding of my life. I was raised by my grandfather, Edward Ashworth, my mother's father, after my parents died in a car accident when I was 9. He brought me up in his home in Savannah, a large, elegant house with wraparound porches, too many rooms, and a kitchen that always smelled like fresh biscuits. Grandpa represented old Southern wealth, the kind that wears the same watch for decades and never mentions its value. He ran a private equity firm downtown and carried a reputation that made people take notice. In 20 years, he never made me feel like a burden. He had also, as it turned out, been quietly sending $250,000 every month to an account I had never accessed. I met Mark Calloway at a fundraiser 3 years ago. He worked in finance, was charming, and more attractive in person than in photos. He laughed at the right moments and remembered small details I had mentioned weeks earlier, something I later realized was a skill, not a personality trait. We dated for 8 months. He proposed at the same restaurant where our first dinner. Grandpa approved of him, and that mattered to me, probably more than it should have. Grandpa was usually an excellent judge of character, except when someone was deliberately performing for him. The warning signs were there. I just had a very effective way of dismissing them. The joint account Mark suggested and then directed all my income into seemed practical at the time. Letting him manage our finances because he was better with numbers felt like a fair division of responsibility. But our grocery budget kept shrinking while his wardrobe kept growing. I found myself calculating menu prices while he never did. He began referring to my grandfather's wealth as something we'd eventually access. I told myself each of these things was minor, just normal adjustments when 2 lives merge. Then I became pregnant. Expenses increased quickly, Mark became distant, and the small imbalances grew into larger ones. At 6 months pregnant, I took a second job, 2 overnight shifts a week cleaning office buildings because our checking account was unstable and I needed some control. I didn't tell Grandpa. I felt embarrassed. I thought it was our responsibility to manage. Mark knew about the job. He called it industrious. Once, he brought me a smoothie before a shift, kissed my forehead, and said he was proud of me. At the same time, $8 million was sitting in an account under his control. I just didn't know it yet. The first thing that caught my attention was the Amazon deliveries. This started around the 4th month of my pregnancy. Mark's mother, Vivian, had begun visiting more often. She lived 40 minutes away, but seemed to have unlimited flexibility in her schedule. They had a close relationship, close enough that I often felt like an outsider. They had opinions about everything in our home, including how I organize the kitchen, usually presented. Start at the beginning. Don't add opinions. I spoke for 40 minutes. She took notes without looking up, asked 3 brief follow-up questions, and when I finished, she said, "Good. Now let me show you what we already have." She opened the folder. 3 years of wire transfer records, every payment dated and time-stamped, moving from my grandfather's account into the joint household account. Then, within 72 hours of each deposit, portions were transferred into a second account, a private account in Mark's name at a bank in Delaware. "Jessica," she said, "when your grandfather noticed irregularities in the payment confirmations, he contacted me." She turned a page. "There is also a third account, offshore, in the Cayman Islands. Approximately $1.2 million was moved there over 18 months. The number felt overwhelming, like a second impact after the first. She continued. Credit card statements showed Vivian Calloway as an authorized user on one of Mark's private cards. $12,000 in a single month, luxury hotels, restaurants, a jeweler in Atlanta, and a receipt for a weekend in the Bahamas. Mark and Vivian, while I was in my second trimester, while I was delaying medical tests because of the copay. Then she reached the final document. "This," she said, "is the piece that makes everything else secondary." She slid a printed transcript across the table, a conversation with timestamps, pulled from the cloud backup of Vivian's Amazon Echo. The smart speaker in her kitchen had recorded it automatically. Mark's voice, then Vivian's, then Mark again. "She'll never find out. Old Edward trusts me completely, and if he does find out, Claire will take my side. She always does." I read it twice, my vision blurred at the edges. "Are you all right?" Patricia asked. "Continue," I said. She explained the legal plan: fraud, financial abuse under Georgia domestic statutes, and civil theft. The filing would happen in the morning. At the same time the documents were served, 9 a.m. sharp, her office would release a press release to 3 financial news networks. I looked up. Why issue a press release? Because Mark finalized a 7-figure investor deal last Tuesday, a venture capital group out of Atlanta, $3.4 million committed, with a second tranche pending. She folded her hands. Those investors deserve to understand who they've trusted with their money. My heart was racing. Will the case hold? The transcript alone is strong. The financial records are definitive. The offshore account will involve a separate federal matter which is already being addressed. She closed the folder. By noon tomorrow, every phone in Mark Calloway's life will be ringing, and for the first time in 3 years, he won't have answers. That night, I sat in my grandfather's kitchen at 1:30 a.m., Nora asleep in a bassinet beside me, a cup of tea in my hands that I wasn't really tasting. I thought about the version of myself who had cleaned office floors at 6 months pregnant and felt grateful for the extra income. I thought about how shame works, how it settles quietly and convinces you the problem is yours alone. The constant budgeting, the stress over groceries, the borrowed maternity clothes I had told myself were temporary, just part of building a life. I had been so careful not to ask my grandfather for help, so careful to appear capable, so certain I was being independent. It wasn't independence, it was being exploited so carefully I didn't realize it was happening. Mark called 7 times that night. I watched his name appear and disappear on my screen and felt nothing but exhaustion. He was still calling the next morning when Patricia sent a message at 9:02 a.m. Served. I set my phone down and looked at Nora's hand wrapped around my finger. At 9:47, Vivian called. I could hear her raised voice before I even brought the phone to my ear, so I held it away and let it go to voicemail. At 10:15, Patricia texted again. Lead investor withdrew both tranches. $3.4 million gone. At 10:52, a financial journalist, David Park from the Atlanta Business Chronicle with 15 years covering regional markets, called my grandfather directly after receiving the press release. He had questions.
Grandpa referred him to Patricia, who was already speaking with the Associated Press. At 11:58, Mark called again. I watched the screen until the call ended, then turned the phone.
She also made a comment from the bench, which Patricia later told me was unusual. Judges typically limit their remarks to procedure, but she noted the calculated and sustained nature of the financial control shown in the record. Mark didn't look at me as we left the courtroom. I hadn't expected him to, but I noticed it anyway. The Business Chronicle article ran on a Thursday. David Park's byline appeared prominently with the headline, "The Other Account: How a Savannah Finance Manager Redirected 8 Figures in Family Funds Over 3 Years." It was precise, well-sourced, and detailed. It identified the Delaware account and the Cayman account. It quoted 3 investors who had either withdrawn or paused their involvement with Mark's firm. It included a statement from Patricia on my behalf and a brief response from Gerald Hastings that offered little substance. By Friday morning, the Associated Press had picked it up. By that afternoon, it appeared on 3 financial news aggregators and 2 general outlets. Mark's firm had 9 employees. By the following Monday, 6 had resigned. His mother, Vivian, called me twice during that period. The first time, I let it go to voicemail. The message was long, shifting between anger and appeal, and it was clear she understood that her involvement, through the authorized card and the recorded conversation, had significantly affected her position. The second call came the day after the Associated Press coverage. I answered, not because I intended to respond, but because I wanted to hear whether she would acknowledge responsibility or continue defending her position. She continued defending it. She said I was damaging a good man. She said Mark had only tried to provide for our family. She insisted I owed her a conversation. "You were using his card, Vivian, the one funded by money meant to cover my basic expenses." She ended the call. 3 months after the hearing, I was sitting on my grandfather's porch on a Saturday morning, Nora in my lap, coffee cooling beside me, when he came out and sat next to me. We watched the street quietly, the usual neighborhood sounds: birds, a sprinkler, a child riding past on a bicycle. "I want to tell you something," he said. I turned toward him. "I should have set it up differently from the start. A direct account in your name only. I trusted him because you trusted him, and I relied on your judgment instead of my own. That was my mistake." "Grandpa, let me finish." He kept his eyes on the street. "I told myself the money was for your marriage, not specifically for you, that it should be managed jointly because that's how marriages function. I justified it in ways that avoided closer scrutiny." He paused. "I'm sorry, Claire, for the cleaning job, for the financial stress, for every moment you felt alone and believed it was your responsibility." My throat tightened. "I didn't know." "I know," he said. "That's why it worked." He looked at me then. He depended on both of us not looking closely. We sat with that for a while. Patricia says the recovery case is strong. Between the domestic accounts and the offshore funds, most of it should be recoverable. The Cayman account is frozen. The federal process is moving forward. It may take about 18 months. He nodded. The rest will likely come through the defamation case. Gerald Hastings contacted Patricia last week. Mark wants to settle before discovery. "She declined," I said. "She did," our grandpa almost smiled. "She believes discovery will be more beneficial at this stage." Apparently, Hastings agreed quickly. The Associated Press article had mentioned Mark's statements at the charity event. Within 2 weeks of publication, most of his remaining professional relationships had ended. The venture capital group not only withdrew their funding, but also filed their own civil complaint, creating an additional legal front. Agent Riley's federal investigation continued separately, progressing at what Patricia described as a slow but certain pace. Mark's firm had officially closed.
According to recent legal correspondence, he was living in a short-term rental in Marietta and requested a modification to the protective order to allow supervised visits with Nora. Patricia responded with a structured proposal, conditions she described as reasonable if he was sincere, and clarified,
"I saved it, not for myself, but for Nora, so that when she's old enough to ask questions about her father, she can hear his voice directly, understand how he expressed remorse, and decide for herself how much meaning to give it." That is the pattern with people like Mark. They tend to believe that the next version of themselves will be the one that finally convinces others. In that recording from Vivian's smart speaker, he said, "I would always take his side." For 3 years, that was true. But always only holds until it doesn't. It takes one moment to change it. And in that moment, I had a grandfather with the resources, the awareness, and the legal support to act. That was enough.